My name is Solomon Turner, and I was born a slave on Whitehaven Plantation in Maryland's Eastern Shore in the year 1805, though I did not truly begin to live until the night I escaped that hell in the winter of 1835, carrying with me wounds that would never heal and a list of names that would never be forgotten. For 30 years I had been the property of Master Edmund Blackwood, a man who believed that breaking the spirit of his human chattel required overseers who understood that mercy was weakness and that fear was the only currency that could purchase obedience from men and women who had been reduced to livestock. I tell you this story not to seek sympathy for the suffering I endured or forgiveness for the blood I spilled in its aftermath, but to offer testimony about what happens when human beings are pushed beyond the boundaries of endurance and discover that vengeance can burn hotter than any flame that mortal men can kindle. The overseers who brutalized me and mine were not monsters born from some supernatural realm of evil. They were ordinary men who had been given license to treat other human beings as property, and who had embraced that license with an enthusiasm that revealed the depths of cruelty that ordinary men can reach when society tells them such cruelty serves a righteous purpose. There were 5 of them over the years, 5 men whose names I carried with me into freedom like sacred prayers, 5 faces that haunted my dreams and focused my purpose with the clarity of divine revelation. Each had contributed his own particular talents to the systematic destruction of everything I had ever loved. Each had left his mark upon my body and soul in ways that would never fade, and each would answer for his crimes when I found the strength and opportunity to make them pay the debt they had accumulated through decades of unpunished evil. Jonas Pike was the first overseer I remember, a man who had arrived at Whitehaven when I was barely 10 years old and who had immediately established his authority through demonstrations of violence so severe that they served as warnings to every slave on the plantation. Pike believed that education was dangerous for slaves, and when he discovered that I had been learning to read and write during stolen moments with the help of Master Blackwood's young daughter, he had me tied to the whipping post and delivered 50 lashes that left scars across my back like a map of suffering that would remind me for the rest of my life of the price of seeking knowledge that was forbidden to my kind. But Pike's greatest crime was not the beating he gave me for learning to read. It was the slow murder of my father, Benjamin Turner, whom he worked to death in the tobacco fields during the brutal summer of 1820. My father was 45 years old when Pike decided that his productivity was declining and that an example needed to be made for the other field hands who might be tempted to slow their pace as age and exhaustion took their toll on bodies that had been worked without rest or adequate nutrition for decades. Pike assigned my father to clear new ground in the swamplands behind the plantation, work that required him to spend 12 hours a day in waist-deep water, cutting through roots and dragging fallen trees, while mosquitoes and water moccasins made his labor a torment that would have broken younger men within days. My father lasted 6 weeks before his body finally surrendered to the combination of exhaustion, malnutrition, and the fever that he had contracted from the stagnant water where Pike forced him to work. I watched him waste away during those final weeks, watched him struggle to maintain his dignity, even as his strength failed and his mind began to wander under the influence of illness that Pike refused to acknowledge or treat. When death finally released him from his suffering, Pike's only comment was that we had lost a good work animal, but that there were plenty more where he came from. Thomas Crawford replaced Pike in 1822, bringing with him a different but no less devastating approach to the management of human property. Where Pike had relied primarily on physical violence to maintain discipline, Crawford understood that psychological cruelty could be equally effective in breaking the spirits of enslaved people while leaving fewer visible marks that might raise questions from visitors or potential buyers. Crawford's specialty was the systematic destruction of family bonds, the deliberate separation of parents from children and husbands from wives whenever he judged that such separations would serve the interests of plantation discipline or Master Blackwood's financial needs. It was Crawford who sold my wife Mary and our 2 young children to a cotton planter in Georgia when I was caught teaching other slaves to read using skills I had acquired, despite Pike's violent attempts to prevent my education. Mary had been pregnant with our 3rd child when Crawford dragged her from our cabin in the middle of the night, loading her and our babies into a wagon that would carry them hundreds of miles away from everything they had ever known. Her screams as the wagon disappeared down the plantation road still echo in my ears 30 years later. a sound that has become the soundtrack to every dream and nightmare I have experienced since that terrible morning. Crawford justified the sale by explaining to Master Blackwood that my continued presence on the plantation represented a threat to good order and discipline, that my ability to read and write made me dangerous to other slaves who might be inspired by my example to seek forbidden knowledge for themselves. But I knew that the real reason for Mary's sale was Crawford's desire to punish me for the crime of maintaining my dignity in the face of his attempts to break my spirit, his understanding that destroying my family would accomplish what physical torture had failed to achieve. Samuel Ward arrived at Whitehaven in 1825, a young man barely 25 years old, who compensated for his lack of experience with enslaved populations by displaying a cruelty that exceeded even Crawford's calculated brutality. Ward had been raised on a small farm in western Maryland, where his family owned only 3 slaves, but he had studied the methods employed on larger plantations and had developed theories about slave management that he was eager to test on the human property under his supervision at Whitehaven. Ward's innovations included the use of iron collars and chains for slaves who were suspected of harboring thoughts of escape, prolonged confinement in underground pits that he had dug specifically for punishment purposes, and the systematic use of sexual violence against enslaved women as a method of demonstrating his absolute power over every aspect of their lives. It was Ward who raped my sister Sarah repeatedly over a period of months, using her body to send a message to every other slave on the plantation about the consequences of showing anything that might be interpreted as defiance or resistance to his authority. When Sarah finally died from injuries that Ward had inflicted during one of his assaults, he ordered her body to be buried in an unmarked grave beyond the plantation boundaries, forbidding any memorial service or mourning that might suggest that her life had possessed value or meaning. But I mourned her privately in the darkness of my cabin, and I added Ward's name to the list that was already growing in my memory, the catalogue of debts that would someday be collected with interest that had been accumulating for years. Marcus Steele became overseer at Whitehaven in 1828, bringing with him a reputation for efficiency that had been earned through the management of slave labor on some of the largest plantations in Maryland and Virginia. Steele understood that profitability required a careful balance between extracting maximum productivity from enslaved workers and maintaining them in condition to continue working over the long term, but his definition of adequate maintenance fell far short of what any reasonable person would consider humane treatment. Under Steele's management, our food rations were reduced to the bare minimum necessary to prevent starvation, our clothing allowances were cut to a single change of garments per year, and our medical care was limited to treatments that would restore our ability to work, rather than address the underlying causes of illness and injury. Steele also instituted a system of competitive productivity that pitted slaves against each other in contests that were designed to increase output while destroying the solidarity that might have enabled collective resistance to his harsh policies. It was during Steele's tenure that I lost my remaining family members one by one, as elderly slaves were worked to death rather than given lighter duties that might have allowed them to live out their final years with some measure of dignity. My mother died of pneumonia during the winter of 1829, her weakened condition the result of inadequate nutrition and clothing that provided insufficient protection against Maryland's bitter cold. My younger brother James was killed in a mill accident that occurred because Steele had ordered the removal of safety guards that slowed production, and my uncle Moses was beaten to death by Steele himself when age and arthritis made it impossible for him to maintain the pace that the overseer demanded from field hands. The final overseer was Daniel Hayes, a man who arrived at Whitehaven in 1832 with credentials that included experience managing slave labor on sugar plantations in Louisiana, where conditions were notoriously harsh, even by the standards of American slavery. Hayes brought with him innovations that he had learned in the Bayou country, methods of discipline and control that treated enslaved people as expendable resources to be consumed in service to maximum short-term profit, rather than maintained for long-term productivity. Hayes's regime marked the beginning of the end of my time at Whitehaven, as his escalating demands for productivity and his increasingly severe punishments for any perceived infractions created conditions that made continued survival seem unlikely for anyone who remained on the plantation. It was Hayes who implemented the dawn-to-dusk work schedule that left no time for rest or recovery, Hayes, who reduced our food rations to starvation levels in order to increase Master Blackwood's profits, and Hayes, who instituted the daily whippings that were designed to maintain discipline through constant fear rather than occasional punishment. But Hayes's greatest crime was not the systematic torture he inflicted on every slave under his supervision. It was the casual murder of Joshua, the elderly man who had served as our unofficial preacher and who had provided spiritual comfort to generations of enslaved people at Whitehaven. Joshua was nearly 70 years old when Hayes decided that his religious influence represented a threat to plantation discipline, and he ordered the old man to be whipped until he renounced his faith and promised to cease conducting prayer meetings in the slave quarters. Joshua's refusal to abandon his calling resulted in a beating that lasted for 3 hours, administered by Hayes personally with a cat-o'-nine-tails that opened wounds across the old preacher's back and chest, while the overseer demanded that he curse God and embrace the hopelessness that Hayes believed was the natural condition of enslaved people. When Joshua continued to pray, even as his life ebbed away under Hayes's lash, the overseer became so enraged that he beat the old man to death while screaming that no slave would be permitted to believe in a God who might judge the actions of white men. That night, as I knelt beside Joshua's broken body and listened to the silence where his voice had once offered comfort to the suffering, I made the decision that would define the rest of my life. I would escape from Whitehaven, not just to claim my own freedom, but to return as an instrument of justice for all those who had died under the hands of overseers who believed that their authority placed them beyond the reach of divine judgment. Each name on my list represented a debt that had been accumulating interest for years, and the time had come to collect what was owed with the only currency that such men understood. The winter of 1835 offered the opportunity I had been waiting for, as heavy snows and bitter cold created conditions that would cover my tracks and slow any pursuit that might be organized when my absence was discovered. I left Whitehaven on February 15, 1835, carrying nothing but the clothes on my back, the list of names burned into my memory, and the absolute conviction that my former overseers would answer for their crimes, regardless of how long it took me to track them down and deliver the justice they had earned through 30 years of unpunished evil. I was no longer Solomon the slave. I had become Solomon the hunter, and the prey I sought had already been marked for death by their own actions. The Maryland winter of 1835 was the harshest in living memory, with snow falling continuously for 6 days after I fled Whitehaven Plantation, and temperatures so cold that even the Chesapeake Bay froze solid for the first time in decades. But that same brutal weather that made travel nearly impossible for a fleeing slave also provided perfect cover for my escape, as the storm that threatened to kill me also erased every trace of my passage and made pursuit impossible for the bloodhounds and mounted patrols that Master Blackwood would surely send after his missing property. I'd been planning my escape for 3 years, ever since Daniel Hayes's murder of Joshua had convinced me that death as a fugitive was preferable to continued life under his sadistic management. During those years of preparation, I had carefully studied the geography of Maryland's eastern shore, memorizing the locations of rivers, roads, and settlements that might serve as landmarks during my flight northward toward Pennsylvania, and the promise of freedom that waited beyond the Mason-Dixon line. More importantly, I had used my ability to read and write, the same forbidden knowledge that had cost me so dearly under Pike and Crawford, to gather intelligence about the underground railroad networks that assisted escaping slaves in their journey to free territory. The same skill that had brought punishment and family separation when I was a slave would now serve as a weapon in my campaign to claim freedom and exact justice from those who had made my bondage a hell on earth. The first week of my escape was the most dangerous, as I had to cover as much distance as possible before the weather cleared and organized pursuit could begin. I traveled by night, following the North Star through forests and frozen swamplands that would have been impassable under normal conditions, but that the unusual cold had transformed into highways that could carry a determined fugitive toward liberty. During the day, I sheltered in abandoned barns, root cellars, and cave systems that provided protection from both the elements and potential discovery by slave catchers who might be operating in the area. My destination during those initial days was the home of Ezra Williamson, a Quaker farmer near Baltimore who was rumored to provide assistance to fugitive slaves despite the severe legal penalties that could result from such activities. Williamson's involvement with the Underground Railroad was an open secret among the enslaved population of Maryland's Eastern Shore. Though no master had ever been able to prove his participation in illegal activities that would have resulted in imprisonment or worse consequences under the Fugitive Slave Act, I reached Williamson's farm on February 22nd, after 7 days of travel through conditions that had nearly killed me several times, arriving at his door frostbitten and half-starved, but alive and still free, despite the best efforts of weather and terrain to stop my flight toward liberty. Williamson's response to my appearance confirmed the stories that had circulated through slave quarters about his willingness to risk his own safety to assist those seeking freedom from bondage. "Come in, friend," he said simply, stepping aside to allow me entry into his warm kitchen where his wife was already preparing food and hot coffee that would restore the strength I had lost during my week in the wilderness. "Thou art safe here for as long as thou needest shelter, and when thou art ready to continue thy journey, we will provide thee with what assistance we can offer." The 3 weeks I spent recovering at the Williamson farm provided me with more than just physical restoration. They gave me access to information that would prove crucial to the mission I had planned for myself once I reached free territory. Ezra maintained correspondence with abolitionists throughout Pennsylvania and Ohio, and his letters contained details about the current locations and activities of former overseers who had left Maryland to seek employment on plantations in other states. Through these networks, I learned that Jonas Pike, the first overseer on my list, had moved to western Pennsylvania following his departure from Whitehaven in 1822, where he had established himself as the manager of an iron foundry that employed both free blacks and fugitive slaves in conditions that were barely better than slavery itself. Pike's reputation for brutality had followed him north, and there were reports that several of his workers had died from injuries sustained during beatings that Pike administered for infractions as minor as tardiness or talking during work hours. Thomas Crawford had relocated to Ohio after leaving Whitehaven, where he had become a slave catcher, specializing in the recapture of fugitives who had reached free territory but could still be legally returned to bondage under federal law. Crawford's knowledge of slave psychology, gained through his years of breaking spirits on the plantation, had made him particularly effective at tracking and capturing escaped slaves who thought they had reached safety in the North. Samuel Ward had moved to Kentucky, where slavery remained legal, and his experience with plantation management had earned him a position overseeing tobacco operations on one of the state's largest estates. Ward's innovations in the use of sexual violence and psychological torture had proven popular with Kentucky planters, who were seeking methods to maintain discipline among enslaved populations that were growing increasingly restive as abolitionist sentiment spread throughout the region. Marcus Steele had established himself in Tennessee, where he managed cotton operations that supplied textile mills in New England with the raw materials that fueled the Industrial Revolution. Steele's expertise in maximizing productivity while minimizing costs had made him wealthy, though his workers continued to die at rates that would have been considered excessive even by the standards of Deep South plantations. Daniel Hayes, the most recent and most hated name on my list, had returned to Louisiana following his departure from Whitehaven, where he had purchased his own sugar plantation with money earned through his career as an overseer. Hayes's reputation for extreme brutality had made him wealthy, as plantation owners throughout the South competed to employ someone whose methods could extract maximum productivity from enslaved labor, regardless of the human cost. This intelligence provided me with a strategic framework for the campaign I planned to conduct against my former tormentors, but it also revealed the scope of the challenge I faced in tracking down 5 men who had scattered across multiple states and who had established themselves in positions where they were protected by law, custom, and the armed force that Southern society used to maintain its peculiar institution. I would need to become more than just a fugitive slave seeking personal freedom. I would need to transform myself into something that could strike fear into the hearts of men who had never known fear because they had always been the ones inflicting it on others. The education I received at the Williamson farm extended beyond geography and intelligence gathering to include practical training in the skills I would need for the work that lay ahead. Ezra's son David was a veteran of the War of 1812 who understood that justice sometimes required violence, and he spent hours teaching me to shoot with accuracy at various ranges, to handle knives and other weapons that could kill quietly when circumstances required stealth, and to move through hostile territory without detection by enemies who would show no mercy if they captured me. "Thou art embarking upon a path that will change thee in ways thou cannot foresee," David warned me during one of our training sessions, his voice carrying the weight of someone who had seen combat and understood its psychological costs. "The men thou seekest deserve whatever fate thou bringest upon them, but remember that each act of violence will leave its mark upon thy soul, and there may come a time when thou wonderest whether the justice thou hast dispensed was worth the price thou hast paid for it." His warning was well-intentioned but unnecessary, because I had already counted the cost of the path I had chosen and found it acceptable compared to the price of allowing my family's murderers to continue their crimes with impunity. The scars that violence might leave on my soul could not be worse than the scars that slavery had already carved into my flesh, and the risk of becoming something terrible in pursuit of justice seemed preferable to remaining something powerless in the face of evil. I left the Williamson farm on March 15, 1835, exactly 1 month after my escape from Whitehaven, carrying with me a new identity as a free black man named Solomon Freeman, documentation that would allow me to travel without being automatically suspected of being a runaway slave, and weapons that would enable me to complete the mission I had set for myself. My first destination would be Western Pennsylvania, where Jonas Pike awaited the justice that was 30 years overdue. The list I carried in my memory had been transformed from a catalogue of grievances into a battle plan that would guide my movements over the months and years ahead. Each name represented not just a personal enemy, but a symbol of the system that had made such enemies possible, and each death would serve not just as revenge, but as a message to other overseers that their crimes would not go unpunished forever. I was no longer Solomon the slave or even Solomon the fugitive. I had become Solomon the instrument of divine justice, and the work that lay ahead would either cleanse the world of 5 men who had forfeited their right to live, or cost me my own life in the attempt. Either outcome seemed preferable to accepting that evil could flourish without consequences, that good men could die unavenged, and that those who profited from human misery could expect to escape judgment for their crimes. The scent of freedom filled my nostrils as I walked the roads that led toward Pennsylvania, but it was mixed with another scent that would guide my steps until my mission was complete, the scent of blood that was owed and would be collected, regardless of how far I had to travel or how long I had to wait for opportunities to settle accounts that had been accumulating interest for decades. Western Pennsylvania, in the spring of 1835, was a land of contradictions, where the smoke from iron foundries mixed with the fresh air of mountain wilderness, and where free blacks worked alongside fugitive slaves in conditions that blurred the line between liberty and bondage. I arrived in Pittsburgh in early April, carrying the false papers that identified me as Solomon Freeman, a free man seeking employment in the mills and foundries that were transforming the region into one of America's industrial centers. The search for Jonas Pike led me through a network of taverns, boarding houses, and work sites where information could be purchased with whiskey or extracted through careful conversation with men who had no reason to suspect that the questions came from someone with deadly intent. Pike's reputation had preceded him to Pennsylvania, and his name was spoken with a mixture of fear and disgust by the workers who had encountered his methods of labor management during the 13 years since he had fled Maryland under circumstances that remained unclear to most people who knew him. I found him operating a small iron foundry on the outskirts of Pittsburgh, where he employed 20 men in conditions that would have been familiar to anyone who had experienced plantation slavery. The workers, mostly free blacks and Irish immigrants who had few alternatives for employment, labored 14 hours a day in temperatures that regularly exceeded 100 degrees, producing pig iron that Pike sold to larger foundries at substantial profit, while paying his employees wages that barely covered the cost of food and shelter. Pike himself had changed little during the 13 years since I had last seen him, though prosperity had added weight to his frame and fine clothes to his wardrobe. His face still carried the same cruel expression that I remembered from childhood, the look of a man who took pleasure in the suffering of others, and who viewed such pleasure as his natural right as someone born to command rather than obey. But what struck me most forcefully was how diminished he seemed outside the context of plantation authority, how much of his power had depended upon the system that gave him legal ownership over the bodies and souls of his victims. My opportunity came during the 3rd week of my surveillance, when Pike's evening routine took him through a section of town where industrial noise would mask any sounds that might result from our final confrontation. He had developed a habit of visiting a tavern that catered to men who shared his tastes for alcohol and violence, spending his evenings drinking and boasting about his expertise in managing difficult workers through methods that had been perfected during his years as a plantation overseer. The alley behind Flanagan's Tavern was dark and narrow, filled with the debris of urban commerce and screened from observation by buildings that blocked both moonlight and the curious eyes of passers-by. Pike emerged from his evening of drinking shortly after midnight, his movements unsteady from alcohol, but his voice clear as he continued a conversation with himself about the ungrateful nature of the workers who had made his prosperity possible. "Jonas Pike," I called out as he passed the mouth of the alley, my voice carrying across the 20 feet that separated us with the authority of judgment that had been delayed but never forgotten. "Do you remember the boy you whipped for learning to read? Do you remember the man you worked to death in the swamps? Do you remember Benjamin Turner, who died because you decided that an example needed to be made?" Pike's reaction confirmed that he remembered more than he probably wished to recall, his face going pale even in the dim light as recognition dawned, and he understood that his past had finally caught up with him in ways that he had hoped were impossible. His hand moved toward the knife he carried for protection, but age and alcohol had slowed his reflexes enough to give me the advantage I needed to close the distance between us before he could draw his weapon. The blade I carried was sharp enough to slide between his ribs with minimal resistance, finding his heart with the precision that comes from years of dreaming about this moment and planning the exact method that would be used to deliver justice that had been delayed but never abandoned. Pike's eyes widened as he felt steel enter his chest, and his mouth opened as if to speak words that would somehow undo the crimes that had brought him to this alley on this night. "This is for my father," I whispered, as his life flowed out through the wound that would end his career of brutality forever. "This is for every slave who died under your whip, for every child who was separated from their parents because you decided that such separation served your purposes. This is justice, Jonas Pike, and it has been a long time coming." Pike died without speaking, his blood mixing with the mud and refuse that filled the alley where his body would be discovered by someone who would never understand the significance of what had transpired there. The newspapers would report his death as the result of a robbery gone wrong, another casualty of urban violence that was becoming increasingly common in industrial cities where desperate men competed for scarce opportunities through any means necessary. But I knew the truth of what had happened, and more importantly, I knew that the first name on my list had been crossed off through the kind of direct action that made more sense than any court proceeding or legal process that would have been corrupted by the same system that had made Pike's crimes possible in the first place. One debt had been paid in full, but 4 others remained outstanding, and each would be collected with the same precision that had guided my blade to Pike's heart. The success of my first assassination provided me with confidence that my mission was both possible and righteous, but it also taught me valuable lessons about the importance of careful planning and patient execution that would serve me well during the hunts that lay ahead. Pike's death had been easier than I had anticipated, partly because he had grown complacent during his years in Pennsylvania, and partly because he had never imagined that his victims might possess the capability to track him down and exact personal revenge for their suffering. The other names on my list would likely prove more challenging targets, as my success against Pike would eventually become known throughout the network of former overseers and slave catchers who maintained contact with each other across state lines. Word would spread that someone was systematically hunting men who had built their careers on the brutalization of enslaved people, and those who remained would take precautions that would make my work more difficult, but not impossible. Thomas Crawford was next on my list, and intelligence from my Underground Railroad contacts indicated that he was operating in southern Ohio, where his skills as a slave catcher had made him wealthy and feared throughout the free black communities that provided shelter for fugitive slaves. Crawford's reputation for psychological warfare and his knowledge of slave psychology would make him a more formidable opponent than Pike had been, but they would also make his elimination more satisfying when I finally tracked him down. I left Pittsburgh on May 1st, 1835, carrying with me the satisfaction of a successful hunt and the anticipation of challenges that lay ahead. The transformation from victim to avenger was complete, and each mile that carried me closer to my next target was also carrying me further from the helpless slave I had been at Whitehaven and closer to the instrument of justice I had chosen to become. The list in my memory was no longer just a catalogue of grievances. It had become a strategic document that would guide my movements until every debt had been collected and every crime had been answered with appropriate punishment. Pike's blood had been the first payment, but it would not be the last, and each subsequent death would carry forward the message that evil actions had consequences that could not be escaped through distance, time, or the protection that society offered to those who served its interests through the systematic brutalization of the powerless. 4 names remained, and each would learn that their past had caught up with them in ways they had never imagined possible. The hunt was just beginning, and I was discovering that I had a talent for this work that surprised me with its intensity and focus. Justice delayed was not justice denied when it was pursued by someone who understood that patience was merely another weapon in the arsenal of the righteous. Thomas Crawford's trail led me deep into southern Ohio, where the boundaries between freedom and slavery blurred in ways that revealed the hollow nature of legal distinctions when they conflicted with economic interests and racial prejudices that transcended state lines. Crawford had established himself in Portsmouth, a river town where the Ohio separated free territory from the slave state of Kentucky, and where the Underground Railroad conducted a deadly game of cat and mouse with professional slave catchers who made their living returning human property to Southern masters. I spent 2 months learning Crawford's habits and studying his methods, understanding that he represented a far more dangerous opponent than Pike had been because his entire livelihood depended upon his ability to track and capture people who were trying to hide from men exactly like him. Crawford had developed an almost supernatural ability to think like a fugitive slave, to anticipate the decisions that desperate people would make when their freedom depended upon staying one step ahead of pursuers who possessed superior resources and legal authority. His success as a slave catcher had made Crawford wealthy enough to employ a network of informants throughout the black communities of southern Ohio, men and women who had been coerced or bribed into reporting suspicious activities that might indicate the presence of fugitive slaves in their neighborhoods. This network made my surveillance of Crawford extremely dangerous, because any stranger asking questions about his whereabouts would quickly be reported to him directly, potentially triggering a manhunt that would reverse our respective roles as hunter and prey. But Crawford's very expertise created vulnerabilities that could be exploited by someone who understood his psychology and methods well enough to turn them against him. His success had made him arrogant, confident in his ability to outthink and outmaneuver any fugitive slave who might cross his path, and this arrogance blinded him to the possibility that one of his former victims might have acquired skills that matched or exceeded his own abilities as a tracker and hunter. My opportunity came when Crawford received a commission to recapture a family of fugitive slaves who had escaped from a Kentucky plantation and were reportedly hiding somewhere in the hills north of Portsmouth. The bounty for this family was substantial enough to require Crawford to undertake the search personally, rather than delegating it to subordinates, and the terrain where the fugitives were believed to be hiding was remote enough to isolate him from the support networks that normally protected him during his hunting expeditions. I followed Crawford into the hills on July 15, 1835, maintaining a distance that kept me invisible, while allowing me to observe his tracking methods and anticipate his route through terrain that would eventually provide me with the opportunity I had been seeking for months. Crawford was skilled, I had to admit, reading sign and interpreting evidence with an expertise that explained his success in a profession where failure often meant the loss of valuable bounties to competitors who were equally ruthless but more competent. But Crawford's focus on tracking the fugitive family made him inattentive to the possibility that he himself was being stalked by someone who had learned patience and cunning during 30 years of slavery and 2 months of careful planning. His attention was directed forward, toward the prey he was pursuing, rather than backward toward the predator, who was closing the distance between them with each mile they traveled deeper into the wilderness. The confrontation came on the 3rd day of the hunt, when Crawford's pursuit of the fugitive family led him into a narrow valley where the terrain would limit his options for escape or calling for assistance. I had anticipated this route based on my study of his methods and had positioned myself to intercept him at a point where the trail narrowed between steep hillsides that would prevent him from detecting my approach until it was too late for evasive action. "Thomas Crawford," I called out, as he paused to examine tracks that would lead him toward his intended victims, my voice echoing off the hillsides with an authority that froze him in place as surely as if I had pointed a rifle at his chest. "Do you remember Mary Turner and her 2 children? Do you remember dragging them from their cabin in the middle of the night and loading them into a wagon that carried them away from everything they had ever known?" Crawford's hand moved toward his pistol with the practiced speed of someone who had faced dangerous situations before, but his movement was slowed by the shock of recognition as he understood that his past had followed him into these hills in ways that he had never anticipated. His face went pale as he realized that the voice confronting him belonged to the slave whose family he had destroyed 13 years earlier, and that their reunion would likely end with his death. "Solomon Turner," he said, his voice carrying a mixture of surprise and grudging respect for the skill that had allowed me to track him without detection. "I wondered if you were still alive. Wondered if you had the courage to do more than just run away from Whitehaven like the other slaves who couldn't face the realities of their situation." "I did more than run away," I replied, moving closer while keeping my rifle trained on his chest with the steadiness that came from months of practice and years of patient planning. "I got free, and then I came back to collect debts that have been accumulating interest since the day you tore my family apart for the crime of my seeking knowledge that you thought should be forbidden to my kind." Crawford's attempt to draw his weapon was swift, but not swift enough to overcome the advantage I had gained through surprise and preparation. My rifle shot took him in the chest with enough force to knock him backward against a tree, where he slumped with blood spreading across his shirt, while his eyes remained fixed on my face with an expression that mixed pain with something that might have been acknowledgement of the justice in what was happening to him. "This is for Mary," I said as I approached his dying form, my voice steady despite the emotion that threatened to overwhelm me as 13 years of grief finally found expression in appropriate action. "This is for little James and Sarah, who were barely old enough to walk when you sold them away from their parents. This is for every family you destroyed because you understood that breaking hearts was easier than breaking spirits." Crawford died without speaking, his blood soaking into Ohio soil that had been consecrated as free territory, but that had failed to provide genuine freedom to the people he had hunted throughout his career as a professional slave catcher. His death would be discovered eventually by other searchers looking for the same fugitive family he had been pursuing, but they would find only a corpse that told no story about the justice that had been administered in these hills. The fugitive family that Crawford had been tracking was never recaptured, though I doubt they ever understood that their freedom had been preserved through the elimination of the man who had represented their greatest threat. Their escape to Canada was successful, according to underground railroad networks that monitored such outcomes, and they lived to raise their children in genuine liberty rather than the conditional freedom that existed even in the so-called free states. Crawford's death marked the halfway point in my campaign against the overseers, who had made my life at Whitehaven a hell on earth, but it also represented a turning point in my understanding of what this mission would ultimately cost me. Pike's killing had been satisfying in its simplicity, a straightforward act of revenge that required no complex moral calculations. But Crawford's death forced me to confront the reality that my actions were transforming me into someone who might be as dangerous as the men I was hunting, someone whose dedication to justice might be creating its own forms of injustice. These philosophical concerns did not weaken my resolve or alter my commitment to completing the task I had set for myself, but they did add layers of complexity to my understanding of what justice meant when it was administered by someone who had been both victim and witness to crimes that no legal system would ever acknowledge or punish. I was becoming something new through this process, something that existed outside the normal categories of law and morality, and I was not entirely certain what that transformation would ultimately produce. Samuel Ward was next on my list, and intelligence from abolitionist networks indicated that he was now managing a tobacco plantation in central Kentucky, where his innovations in psychological torture and sexual violence had earned him a reputation that attracted the attention of planters throughout the region, who were seeking new methods to maintain discipline among increasingly restive enslaved populations. Ward's location in slave territory would make approaching him more dangerous than my previous targets had been, but it would also provide opportunities that did not exist in free states, where his actions might attract unwanted scrutiny from authorities. I left Ohio in late July 1835, traveling south through networks that guided fugitive slaves in the opposite direction, using my false identity as Solomon Freeman to explain my presence in regions where free blacks were viewed with suspicion and required to carry documentation proving their legal status. The journey took me through landscapes that seemed designed to remind me of everything I had lost and everything I was fighting to avenge. Tobacco fields where enslaved people worked under conditions identical to those I had endured at Whitehaven. Plantation houses that represented the accumulated wealth generated by unpaid labor. And slave quarters that housed the kind of suffering I had experienced for 30 years. Kentucky in 1835 was a state caught between competing visions of its future, with eastern regions dominated by tobacco plantations that depended upon enslaved labor, while western areas were developing industrial and commercial economies that created opportunities for free workers regardless of race. This division created spaces where someone like me could move with relative freedom, as long as I maintained my cover identity and avoided actions that might attract official attention to my presence or my purposes. Ward's plantation was located near Lexington, in the heart of Kentucky's tobacco country, where he managed 300 enslaved people under conditions that exceeded even Whitehaven's brutality through the systematic application of methods he had developed during his years in Maryland. His reputation had spread throughout the South, and he was frequently invited to speak at gatherings of plantation owners who were eager to learn techniques that might increase productivity while maintaining absolute control over enslaved populations. My surveillance of Ward revealed that he had refined the cruelties that had made him notorious at Whitehaven into a comprehensive system of oppression that broke the spirits of enslaved people through carefully calculated combinations of physical violence, psychological torture, and sexual assault. He had established a reign of terror that kept his workers in a state of constant fear, while generating profits that had made both him and the plantation's owner wealthy beyond anything that conventional management methods could have achieved. But Ward's very success had also made him overconfident in ways that created vulnerabilities I could exploit if I possessed sufficient patience and skill to wait for the right opportunity. His reputation had insulated him from criticism or oversight, and his wealth had purchased the kind of legal and social protection that made him believe he was untouchable by anyone who might wish to hold him accountable for his crimes. The opportunity I had been waiting for came during the first week of September, when Ward's duties required him to travel to a remote section of the plantation to oversee the punishment of slaves who had been accused of plotting an escape attempt. The location was isolated enough to provide privacy for the brutal spectacle that Ward planned to use as a demonstration of what happened to enslaved people who dared to dream of freedom, and that same isolation would serve my purposes when the time came to administer justice for crimes that went far beyond the immediate offense he was planning to punish. I followed Ward and his party to the secluded grove where the punishment was scheduled to take place, positioning myself where I could observe the proceedings while remaining hidden from detection by the overseers and guards who accompanied him. What I witnessed during the next hour confirmed everything I had heard about Ward's methods and reminded me why his name deserved to be on the list I carried in my memory like a sacred text. The suspected slaves were tied to trees and subjected to beatings that continued until Ward judged that they were near death. But the physical violence was only one component of a carefully orchestrated campaign of terror that included the rape of female prisoners in full view of their family members and the systematic destruction of personal possessions that represented the only dignity that enslaved people were permitted to maintain. Ward conducted this spectacle with the enthusiasm of someone who took genuine pleasure in the suffering of others, and his running commentary revealed a psychology that had been corrupted by power into something that barely qualified as human. When the punishment was concluded and Ward's party began to disperse, I followed him as he returned alone to the plantation house, understanding that this might be my only opportunity to reach him without encountering the armed guards who normally protected him during his movements around the property. Ward's route took him through a section of woodland that provided perfect cover for the kind of confrontation I had been planning since learning of his location in Kentucky. "Samuel Ward," I called out as he passed the point where I had positioned myself, my voice carrying across the forest's stillness with an authority that stopped him in his tracks as surely as a physical blow. "Do you remember Sarah Turner? Do you remember what you did to her night after night until her body couldn't endure any more of your attention?" Ward's reaction was faster than Pike's or Crawford's had been, his hand reaching his pistol and clearing the holster, before he turned to face the source of the voice that had spoken his name, with such obvious intent. But speed was not enough to overcome the advantage I had gained through careful positioning and patient planning, and my rifle shot took him in the chest before he could aim his weapon with sufficient accuracy to pose a genuine threat. Ward fell to the forest floor with his pistol unfired, blood spreading across his shirt, while his eyes remained fixed on my face, with an expression that revealed his understanding of who I was and why I had come to find him after all these years. Unlike Pike and Crawford, who had died quickly, Ward lingered long enough for me to approach and deliver the words that would explain the justice that was being administered in this Kentucky woodland. "This is for Sarah," I said, kneeling beside his dying form so that he could hear every word clearly, despite the weakness that was overtaking him as his life ebbed away. "This is for every woman you violated, because you thought your position gave you the right to treat human beings as objects for your pleasure. This is for every family you destroyed and every spirit you broke, because you enjoyed having power over people who couldn't fight back." Ward tried to speak, perhaps to offer some justification for his actions or to plead for mercy that he had never shown to any of his victims, but death claimed him before he could form words that might have revealed whether he possessed any understanding of the harm he had caused, or any regret for the choices that had brought him to this moment of reckoning. His body would be discovered the next morning by plantation workers, who would report his death as the result of an attack by unknown assailants, probably abolitionists or escaped slaves, who had targeted him because of his reputation for harsh discipline. The investigation that followed would produce no useful evidence about the identity of his killer, and Ward's death would eventually be classified as another casualty of the tensions that were building between pro-slavery and anti-slavery forces throughout the border states. 3 names had been crossed off my list, but 2 remained, and each would prove more challenging than those who had preceded them, as word of the mysterious deaths began to circulate through networks of overseers and slave catchers who understood that someone was systematically hunting men who had built their careers on the brutalization of enslaved people. Marcus Steele and Daniel Hayes would be warned by Ward's fate, and their preparations for my eventual arrival would test every skill I had developed during my months as an instrument of delayed justice. But I had tasted blood 3 times now, and each killing had reinforced my conviction that this mission was not only necessary but righteous in ways that transcended the normal boundaries of law and morality. Pike, Crawford, and Ward had all received justice that was perfectly calibrated to their crimes, and their deaths had probably saved the lives of countless enslaved people who would have suffered under their management in the years ahead. The hunt was entering its final phase, and I was discovering that I possessed both the patience and the skill necessary to complete the task I had set for myself, regardless of the precautions that my remaining targets might take to protect themselves. Justice delayed had become justice delivered, and each death had brought me closer to the peace that could only come from knowing that my family's murderers had answered for their crimes with the only currency they understood. 2 names remained on my list, and both would learn that the past could not be escaped through distance, time, or the protection that society offered to those who served its interests through the systematic destruction of human dignity and life. By the autumn of 1835, word of the systematic elimination of former plantation overseers had begun to circulate through the networks that connected slaveholders, slave catchers, and their agents throughout the South. The deaths of Jonas Pike, Thomas Crawford, and Samuel Ward had been attributed to various causes: robbery, abolitionist violence, and random crime. But men who understood the dangerous business of managing enslaved populations recognized patterns that suggested something more focused and personal was hunting those who had made their careers through the brutalization of human property. Marcus Steele, who had received the plantation at Whitehaven in Tennessee, was among those who understood that the deaths were not coincidental. Intelligence from his contacts throughout the region had provided him with details about the circumstances surrounding each killing, and his experience managing enslaved people had given him insights into the psychology of someone who might possess both the motivation and the capability to track down specific targets across multiple states. Steele had taken precautions that reflected his understanding of the threat he faced, surrounding himself with armed guards and limiting his movements to secure locations where ambush would be difficult to execute successfully. But Daniel Hayes, the final name on my list, had reacted to the news of his colleagues' deaths with the arrogance that had characterized his approach to plantation management during his time at Whitehaven. Hayes had established himself as the owner of his own sugar plantation in Louisiana, where his wealth had purchased the kind of political and legal protection that made him believe he was untouchable by anyone seeking to hold him accountable for his past actions. His response to warnings from other overseers was to increase the brutality of his methods, demonstrating to any potential enemies that he remained as dangerous as ever and would not be intimidated by threats from former slaves or abolitionist sympathizers. My pursuit of these final two targets required different strategies than I had employed against Pike, Crawford, and Ward, because both Steele and Hayes were now aware that they were being hunted and had taken measures to protect themselves that would make direct approaches extremely dangerous. But their very awareness of the threat also created opportunities that could be exploited by someone who understood their psychology and could anticipate their responses to perceived dangers. I decided to target Steele first, understanding that his location in Tennessee would make him more accessible than Hayes, who had retreated to the fortress-like environment of his Louisiana plantation, where he was protected by private armies and political connections that would make any attempt on his life extremely hazardous. Steele's precautions were thorough but conventional, designed to defend against the kind of direct attacks that most enemies might attempt rather than the patient, methodical approach I had developed over months of successful hunting. My journey to Tennessee required careful planning and coordination with underground railroad networks that could provide intelligence about Steele's current location and security arrangements. The assistance I received from abolitionists who had heard about my mission revealed the broader significance that my campaign had acquired within anti-slavery circles, where the elimination of notorious overseers was viewed as a form of justice that complemented their own efforts to undermine the institution of slavery through legal and political means. "You have become something of a legend among the enslaved people of the South," explained Jeremiah Collins, a free black minister who had been coordinating assistance for fugitive slaves through churches in Nashville. "Word has spread that someone is holding overseers accountable for their crimes, and that knowledge has given hope to people who had believed that such justice was impossible in a world where white men could murder black people without consequence." This information both encouraged and concerned me, because while widespread support for my mission could provide practical assistance in tracking my remaining targets, it could also increase the likelihood that my identity would be discovered by authorities who were beginning to investigate the pattern of deaths with greater intensity and resources. The bounty on my head, while not yet official, was rumored to be substantial enough to attract professional manhunters who possessed skills that matched or exceeded my own abilities as a tracker and killer. Steele's cotton plantation was located near Memphis, where he had established himself as one of Tennessee's most successful agricultural entrepreneurs through methods that maximized productivity by treating enslaved workers as expendable resources to be consumed in service to short-term profit rather than maintained for long-term productivity. His operation generated enormous wealth for both himself and the investors, who had provided capital for his expansion into new territories, but it also produced casualty rates among enslaved workers that exceeded even the brutal standards that were considered normal throughout the cotton-growing regions of the Deep South. My surveillance of Steele's operation revealed security measures that reflected his understanding of the threat he faced, including armed patrols that circled the plantation boundaries, guard dogs that would detect intruders attempting to approach under cover of darkness, and a network of informants among the enslaved population who had been coerced into reporting suspicious activities that might indicate the presence of potential assassins. These precautions made direct approach to Steele extremely dangerous, but they also created routines that could be studied and exploited by someone who possessed sufficient patience to wait for the right opportunity. The weakness in Steele's security arrangements was his reliance on local law enforcement and political connections that required him to maintain a public presence in Memphis society, attending functions and conducting business that took him away from the controlled environment of his plantation. His wealth and social position demanded that he participate in activities that exposed him to risks that could not be completely eliminated through private security measures, and it was during one of these necessary exposures that I found my opportunity. The Tennessee State Agricultural Fair in October 1835 provided the perfect setting for my final approach to Steele, as the event brought together planters from throughout the region for competitions and exhibitions that celebrated the prosperity that enslaved labor had generated for their class. Steele's participation in the fair was both professional obligation and personal vanity, as he competed for prizes that would recognize his innovations in plantation management while networking with other agriculturalists who might provide opportunities for future business expansion. My attack came during the evening of October 20th, when Steele was returning to his hotel after a dinner celebrating his victory in the cotton production competition that had recognized his plantation as the most efficient operation in Tennessee. The route from the restaurant to his lodgings took him through a section of downtown Memphis that provided opportunities for ambush despite the presence of bodyguards who had been hired specifically to protect him during his visit to the city. "Marcus Steele," I called out as he passed the mouth of an alley where I had positioned myself after hours of patient waiting, my voice carrying across the street with authority that stopped both him and his guards in their tracks. "Do you remember the winter of 1829, when you reduced our food rations to starvation levels? Do you remember my mother, Rebecca Turner, who died of pneumonia because you decided that warm clothing was an unnecessary expense?" Steele's bodyguards reached for their weapons with practiced efficiency, but their training had prepared them for conventional attacks rather than the kind of precision rifle fire that I had perfected over months of hunting men who had made themselves enemies of justice. My first shot killed the guard on Steele's left before he could draw his pistol, while my second shot took the man on his right through the chest as he attempted to return fire from behind the questionable cover of a horse-drawn cart. Steele himself proved more resilient than I had anticipated, drawing his own weapon and firing shots that came close enough to demonstrate that he possessed genuine skill rather than the mere bravado that had characterized some of my previous targets. But accuracy under pressure was a skill that I had developed through necessity, while his was based on practice that had never been tested under life or death circumstances, and the difference proved decisive when our confrontation moved to close range. My final shot took him in the chest as he attempted to reload his pistol, the impact knocking him backward against a storefront window that shattered under his weight and sent glass cascading onto the sidewalk where his blood was already beginning to pool. Steele lived long enough to recognize me, his eyes widening as he understood that the slave he had brutalized at Whitehaven had somehow acquired the skills and resources necessary to track him across multiple states and exact personal vengeance for crimes that he had probably never expected to answer for. "This is for my mother," I said as I approached his dying form, my voice steady despite the exhaustion that was beginning to overwhelm me after months of hunting and killing men who had represented different aspects of the same fundamental evil. "This is for my brother James, who died in your mill because you removed safety guards to increase production. This is for Uncle Moses, who you beat to death when age made it impossible for him to maintain the pace you demanded from field hands." Steele died without speaking, his final expression revealing nothing about whether he possessed any understanding of the justice that was being administered or any regret for the choices that had brought him to this moment of reckoning. His death would trigger investigations that would eventually connect his killing to the murders of Pike, Crawford, and Ward, leading to the realization that someone was systematically hunting former plantation overseers with a precision that suggested personal knowledge of their histories and methods. 4 names had been crossed off my list, but one remained, and Daniel Hayes represented the culmination of everything I had learned about both hunting and justice during my months as an instrument of delayed retribution. Hayes had returned to Louisiana, where he operated his own sugar plantation under conditions that exceeded even his brutal management of enslaved people at Whitehaven, and his elimination would require every skill I had developed, along with resources and support that might be difficult to obtain given the increased attention that law enforcement was paying to the pattern of overseer murders. But Hayes was also the man who had murdered Joshua, the elderly preacher, whose death had triggered my decision to escape from Whitehaven and embark upon this campaign of vengeance. His elimination would represent more than just the completion of my list. It would serve as a final act of justice for the man whose faith had sustained our community through years of suffering and who had died because he refused to renounce his belief in a God who would eventually hold oppressors accountable for their crimes. The journey to Louisiana would be the most dangerous leg of my mission, as Hayes's wealth and political connections had provided him with protection that exceeded anything my previous targets had possessed. But I had learned patience through 30 years of slavery and precision through months of successful hunting, and both qualities would serve me well during the final confrontation that would either complete my mission or end my life in the attempt. One name remained on my list, and Daniel Hayes would discover that no amount of wealth or power could protect him from the kind of justice that had been accumulating interest for the 15 years since he had beaten an elderly preacher to death for the crime of maintaining faith in divine justice. The hunt was almost over, and the final reckoning would determine whether my transformation from victim to avenger had served a purpose greater than mere personal satisfaction. This was the story of Solomon Turner of Maryland. After systematically hunting down and killing 4 of his 5 former overseers between 1835–1836, he was captured attempting to reach Daniel Hayes in Louisiana. Turner was tried and executed by hanging in New Orleans on March 15, 1836, but not before his story had spread throughout slave communities across the South, inspiring countless acts of resistance. Hayes himself was found dead in his plantation house 3 months later, under mysterious circumstances, though no connection to Turner was ever proven. Turner's methodical campaign of vengeance became legend among enslaved people, proving that even the most powerless could find ways to hold their oppressors accountable when the law failed to provide justice. The echoes of Solomon's righteous hunt still reverberate through the annals of American history, a chilling reminder that justice delayed is not always justice denied when pursued by hands that refuse to forget and hearts that will not forgive the unforgivable. If this tale of systematic vengeance and the transformation of victim into avenger speaks to something primal in your soul, join our community dedicated to preserving these powerful narratives of resistance. Subscribe to our channel to uncover more stories of those who chose to become the reckoning their oppressors never saw coming, tales that prove sometimes the hunted must become the hunter to balance scales that society refuses to weigh fairly. Your support ensures these voices of uncompromising justice continue to inspire those who understand that some debts can only be paid in blood.